So it's really my pleasure to introduce Doug Gordon. Um, Doug is well known to many folks as one of the amazing co-hosts of the War on Cars. It's literally, Doug, it's my favorite podcast. I mean, it's just I listen to a lot of podcasts, but the War on Cars, I just wait for every episode because what you guys talk about on the War on Cars is so relevant to what we're experiencing every day in Boston and what most people experience across American cities and also obviously outside of America. Really impactful. So if you guys haven't listened to the War on Cars, I'm doing a major plug here. It'll change your perspective and enhance your perspective of how we can win that war. So speaking of the war, and also Doug is a bike advocate. He'll give a little bit more of his history. He's Boston. He's Brooklyn. I was going to say Boston spoke. He's
I move,
Brooklyn.
I'll be Brooklyn spoke, Boston spoke. Yeah.
Eventually, yeah, he will be, but he's Brooklyn spoke and just an amazing bike advocate. And he'll talk about his Boston, not origins, but Boston experience. So his talk is "Winning the War: The Emerging Power of the Bike Lobby in New York City," and it was a fantastic coup to be able to get Doug to talk. But he was to talk here, but he was actually very gracious and said, "I'd love to talk," and has been very enthusiastic. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to Doug. So.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, you guys can all see that. Thumbs up.
Looks good.
All right, good. I'm going to do a little get your beer, product plug, War on Cars, pint glasses. I would have brought some if we were all together. Um, but yeah, thank you, Ken. I really appreciate everybody logging on and being here. I know we're all kind of experiencing like a little bit of Zoom fatigue, but it's fun to be able to get together for something like this. Um, so yeah, I'll just dive into it. And like Ken said, like if you have questions, post them in the chat. I'm happy to stop at any time. I'm happy to go fast so we can have a really great discussion and just talk about stuff. I think we should like treat it like we were at a bar. You know, I would go to the Burn all the time or Red Bones. Let's do it. So yeah, so let's get going. So yeah, this is me. My kids are a little bigger now, but you'll often see me biking around New York on this big Dutch bicycle with my kids in the back and the front. I've been a bike advocate since about 2008, 2009. I started my blog in 2010, Brooklyn Spoke. Um, and I got into it, I think, a lot of the ways other people did, which is just riding around and noticing the ways in which our streets did and didn't work. Um, Started to notice when bike lanes would be on streets where there hadn't been a bike lane the day before, and started to ask, how did that happen? Why did that happen? Who made it happen? And I've just always been curious and just got really involved. So I really just dug all the way in. Um, I kind of have a reputation as being a bit of a thorn in the side of the administration. This is me confronting the mayor outside of the Park Slope YMCA about 3 years ago after a really bad crash that killed a couple of kids on a street where we had been begging for changes for, I think, since about 2008, actually. And there had been a series of crashes before that. So, you know, I like being a bicycle advocate. I don't like always playing the typical advocacy game of like issuing a press release or laying a wreath or holding a vigil. I think like we need direct action, and that's been a big focus of my advocacy for the last now decade going on too. Um, as Ken mentioned, I'm one of the three co-hosts of the War on Cars. We are about to release our 65th episode. You know, I think like we approach this subject of streets and how cities are changing um, from a media and cultural point of view, not so much from like the wonky point of view that I think a lot of advocacy has been focused on. And we tackle cars as a cultural problem to solve, recognizing that some people need cars and they're helpful. Um, I'm also online at Brooklyn Spoke, and I have my own little media company where I do a lot of advising for nonprofits and governments about sort of how to present and sell safe streets. I'm also a TV producer, which will get into my connection with the Boston area a little bit. And I've done stuff for PBS, travel, big networks. And that's come into my advocacy a lot. I talked about this actually now almost a year and a half ago in Boston about storytelling as a way of getting our cause um, out there and really reaching people where they are and giving them information that they can digest. You know, a lot, I talk about this all the time. A lot of the information that we as bike advocates or safe streets advocates or urban planners understand intuitively is not intuitive to other people. Like, how can you take away a lane of car traffic, add a bike lane, and not have that lead to massive amounts of traffic congestion? We understand the answer to that question. Everybody here does, but most regular people don't. So I think, you know, a big part of what we do is explaining and storytelling. I graduated from Tufts University. I won't tell you when, it'll give away how old I am. I really loved it there. It was very different, Medford and Somerville, than it is now. But I really loved it. I love going back. Still friends with tons of people who I graduated with. I lived at 165 College Avenue. Like, to this day, my favorite apartment. I loved it, right across from campus. Easy walk to Davis Square. No bike share and no bike lanes, but I still got around by bike now and then. Yeah, so I worked in 2008 and 2009 in Davis Square at a production company called Powderhouse Productions, and this was our office. And I worked on some stuff for Discovery and then some stuff for WGBH. I did Nova, a 4-part series for Nova on material science, which was a really sort of like boring subject on its own that we really dug into and just made awesome and exciting. It was a really great experience. I would get coffee at Diesel Cafe every day and Anna's Taqueria, have lunch there all the time. So I have great affection for Somerville. I was actually living at a friend's house in Jamaica Plain. I was telling everybody before we all got on here, would bike from JP to Davis nearly every day because I just didn't want to deal with going in on the T and then back out on the T. It was just a straight shot, more or less. And I loved it. It was a great experience, the best way to get around the Boston area. So the subject of my talk is sort of like where things are in New York City. And I know in the Boston area, things are changing. You know, I know Marty Walsh went to DC, and you also have a mayoral election coming up. So I wanted to sort of talk about where we are now, how we got here, and, you know, what it took. So de Blasio is on his way out the door. He will be driven home on January 1st, 2022, in his sort of favorite way of getting around the city. And I think, you know, his legacy is a mixed bag. On the one hand, you've seen protected bicycle lane implementation since 2013, 2014, when he took office, right around here, start to go way up. It's debatable as to whether that's really enough in a city that has 6,000 miles of streets, whether, you know, doing 18, 25, 20 miles a year is enough. But the city will be going out with a lot of protected bike lane miles. They're doing about 30 miles this year, so it's not bad. And a lot of what they've done is they've really tamed some very difficult streets. This is Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, near where I live. You can see the library behind it, a big destination for people. And these are streets that nobody really thought were fixable, and they're slowly fixing them. So they're doing a great job. Unfortunately, you know, the reality of a lot of our bike lanes is more something like this. This is really the daily experience of cycling in New York City. More often than not, it looks like this, you know, with our municipal employees, including our police, being the worst offenders for blocking bike lanes. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I literally just added this to the presentation 20 minutes before I got on. I mean, today our mayor was talking about licenses for cyclists. He's been in office for 7.5 years, and he's still sort of talking like someone who just hasn't learned anything. So, you know, we're still fighting these daily battles, but I do think things have improved immensely over the last 7.5 years. So the way that New York City counts bike ridership is challenging because they go to certain spots, but they mostly really focus on the bridges because they're really good indicators of bike traffic. And I think this graph shows just what a change it's been. So we have March 2020, which is the start of the pandemic, to March of this year. And you can see the Williamsburg Bridge, which is one of the most popular cycling bridges, has gone up a little bit. this year. It was already pretty busy going into the pandemic. The Queensboro Bridge really took off. The Manhattan Bridge, which connects Brooklyn to Manhattan and is what I take most of the time, that saw a big improvement. The Pulaski Bridge, which is a small bridge which connects Brooklyn and Queens, they added a bike lane to it. That took off. And there's a tiny little bit of improvement on the Brooklyn Bridge, but not much. And that's really because the Brooklyn Bridge is basically at capacity. And this is what the bike path looks like during normal times. As you can see, not great conditions for cycling. But the de Blasio administration is kind of going out on a high note, and they are adding a two-way bicycle lane, taking a lane of car traffic from the north side of the bridge. Statue of Liberty would be on the other side. And, you know, it's pretty narrow, but this is one of those, like, I'll take it. It's a great victory to claim that space on the bridge. Pretty sure it'll be a big success. And once it's proven to be too narrow for the bike traffic, we'll claim more space. So it's really great progress. Unfortunately, you know, the pedestrian experience in New York City, which I think, you know, as cyclists, we need to think about a lot too, leaves a lot to be desired. So the next mayor has his or her work really cut out for them. You know, you've heard a lot about Vision Zero in New York City. It's really been a mixed bag. As you can see, there hasn't been a whole lot of progress. Injuries and crashes have remained more or less consistent. We've had a couple of years where crash levels and fatalities went way down, but certainly not as much of an improvement as you might expect given the resources and just oxygen given to Vision Zero in New York. So like I said, the next mayor has a lot of work ahead of them. So what's happening next? Well, we have an election. We are all going to the polls for the primary in June. It's a Democratic primary, and basically whoever wins that primary will essentially be the mayor, unless there's some massive surprise. It's unlikely that the Republican nominee will win. So we have a lot of people running. A few of these people have dropped out since this graphic was made. But it's really like, it feels like this. It just feels like so many choices. We also have ranked choice voting in New York this year, so we'll be able to rank 5 choices. And I want to go through some of who those people are. And I just want to show you like how remarkable some of the stuff that's coming out of their mouths actually is, especially as someone who's a veteran of the bike wars, basically. So this is Catherine Garcia. She's a former sanitation commissioner. She's running. I'm a big fan. You know, she's using this language that like bike lanes should be like a network like the subway. It's really great to hear that. She has proposed a lot of great stuff as part of her bike and climate plan. She's, you know, hundreds of miles of bike lanes in her plan. It's really great. 250 miles. So next up, you know, Eric Adams, who's the borough president of Brooklyn, he's sort of like, I'll see your 250 miles and I will raise you by 50 miles, 300 miles of bike lanes, which is great. I mean, he's not perfect. He parks a lot of cars outside of his office on a pedestrian plaza, but the stuff coming out of his mouth is great too. Then we have Scott Stringer, who I must say just had a sort of Me Too thing, which is really troubling. I have to put that out there and don't want to just say like, hey, this is great. But, you know, he is now 350 miles in 2 years. So everybody's trying to outdo themselves, which is kind of pretty remarkable. And the other really cool thing, this is Scott Stringer's streets plan, where he wants to reclaim local streets for communities and economic opportunity. And you should really pay attention to that phrase, reclaim local streets, because that is literally the mission statement of Transportation Alternatives, our big advocacy group. So the idea that a mayoral candidate would be quoting almost verbatim the mission statement of a bike and pedestrian advocacy group is like, I never thought I would see the day. It's Diane Morales. I'm also a huge fan of her. She just sold her car, bought a bike at Recycle a Bicycle. She's now pulling third, I think. So like she has a real shot depending on how the election goes. She's great. She is literally embracing bicycle advocates. Like this is not something that would have happened not that long ago. I just did a ride with her 2 weeks ago. And again, I want you to kind of look at that reducing car culture stuff up here. She has a really huge plan to expand bicycling and bike share to every community and a lot of historically marginalized communities. It's great. But that reducing car culture language, that's right out of the mouths of advocates. This is an article by Charlie Komanoff, who's a big climate and bike advocate, has been since the 70s in New York. So, like, something has seeped into the ether of the New York City political atmosphere here. It's really remarkable. This is Sean Donovan, who's a former HUD secretary. You know, he wants all of our open streets to become permanent. He's very proud of the fact that he takes the subway, unlike our current mayor who's driven everywhere. And then you have Andrew Yang, who, like, I guess he's going for like the turducken of transportation mobility options, like the bike on the subway. If he could fit a bus in there, I don't know, maybe he would. But they've all been trying to just say, like, yeah, we're the bike candidate. We are the bike candidate. We will make New York City bikeable and safe for walking, and it's great. So I want to kind of rewind then and tell you how we got here. Because as much as I'm excited about this, it was a long, hard slog, which I know is familiar to people in the Boston area and Somerville particularly. So if you rewind to 2013, the end of the Bloomberg administration, the final year of the Bloomberg administration, there was a real fear that all the stuff that Jeanette Sadiq-Khan and Bloomberg had done would disappear. Or if it wouldn't disappear, it just wouldn't be expanded and sort of be left to rot. And the leading mayoral candidates at the time were not supporting bike lanes. This is Christine Quinn, who is the former Speaker of the City Council. She was seen as Bloomberg's heir apparent, and she called bike lanes the third rail of New York City politics, stuff you don't talk about at dinner parties. She was not an enthusiastic supporter. Bill Thompson, who was a big rival for the Democratic nomination, literally his transportation plans was just like parking, put parking everywhere. Change the meters so they're cheaper, all kinds of stuff like that. It was really bad. Even de Blasio, he was asked about the Times Square pedestrian plazas, and he was like, well, the jury's out. He was very wishy-washy on a bunch of the bike lane projects in his own district. He was a former city council person before he became mayor and public advocate. And then if you remember this guy, Anthony Weiner, he was at the time a very likely next mayor of New York City, and he was basically like ready to rip out all the bike lanes because he saw it as just like a good political issue to grab onto and to seize and kind of get real New Yorkers to pay attention to. So the advocates in New York City, and it's very much like other places, and I know Massachusetts had its own streets pact for a little bit, we were really worried, and Transportation Alternatives, being a nonprofit, couldn't endorse, couldn't really get involved in the political side of things. So we formed Streets PAC, the first political action committee, we believe, definitely in the Northeast, if not the country, that was focused on electing candidates who were committed to making New York City safer for walking, for biking, for transit. And it was sort of this philosophy of just like, let's hang out a shingle and look official and take these scrappy advocates and professionalize them a little more and start to put some real teeth into what we were doing. And so basically it was like, this was the step one on our journey, was that we were accused of being this bicycle lobby that had no, you get this all the time, like you have all this power, and I'm sure everybody on this call laughs about like, yeah, we wish we had the power that you say we do. Well, we decided to lean into that and say like, let's start getting some of the power they think we have. So we launched in April of 2013. I was a founding member of the board. I'm no longer on the board. And it got some coverage because we decided also like, hey, everyone's talking about bikes and how controversial they are. We can lean into that too, and we can get some media coverage out of it. And Streets PAC started organizing rides. This was a ride with all the endorsed candidates from Streets PAC from Brooklyn there were two rides from Upper Manhattan, Brooklyn, that met at City Hall. And these three candidates in the front, they all won, and they became city council people. And it was great because basically while we were organizing Streets PAC, New York City was having like the world's biggest freak out over bike share, which was about to launch. Hearing all the stuff that you hear everywhere. And it was really getting kind of out of control. And we just kept pushing forward, saying, no, this stuff is not controversial. We actually think it's popular. We think this is a winning political strategy to make people safe when they bike and when they walk, and to make transit accessible and reliable, especially in places that don't have great options. And of course, you probably have all seen that. Oh, I think I put 2023 as 2013, the kind of crazy rant by an editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal when City Bike launched, calling the bicycle lobby an all-powerful enterprise. So that's going into the summer of 2013 and our mayoral election. But the real truth was actually this stuff was popular. If you saw my Bike Lash talk in Boston, it's my pal Joe Catrufo, who used to work for Transportation Alternatives. And I think this is really true, is that, Bike Lash and the political opposition to these things is generally very small. I think the best you can say is most people are indifferent. And so you have to sort of activate the people who really care and not pay too much attention to the small number of people who don't really have legitimate grievances other than, I'm losing my parking. And that really bore out in the statistics. This was a poll from the basically towards the end of the Bloomberg administration. And just look at the approval for adding bike lanes, 64% for bike lanes, bike sharing, 73% approval, pedestrian plazas, 72% approval. So I just kept telling people, don't pay attention to the controversy. We're going to win this thing. Like, people are going to really come out for this. And then even Anthony Weiner, once City Bike launched, he was like, yeah, I think I better get with the program here. He drops out for reasons we won't go into, because there might be kids at home watching. And then when the primary happened, StreetsPAC, 13 of our 18 city council races, we won. And that was really big. This is Howard Wilson, who was a former advisor and deputy mayor to Bloomberg, former Hillary Clinton guy. And it was a huge moment for us. So once we had those people in place, this was a really great group of people. There's Antonio Reynoso, who's a city council member in Williamsburg, Bushwick. This is him leading a bike train. He's dressed as the L train. He really got into biking, always was a big biker, but really got into it as a city council member. This is Richie Torres from the Bronx, who was a city council member, now a member of Congress. He was a StreetsPAC endorsee. Corey Johnson, who is the current city speaker of the city council on a city bike. And then 2017 rolls around, another election, and we had a new crop of people, some running for their second terms. It's New York, so you hear the honking outside my window. So we really just had these people really embracing cycling. This is Carlina Rivera, who is very likely going to be the next speaker of the city council. She is a big advocate for cycling and for open streets, and not a cyclist. She's just there, biking around in her normal clothes. It's just, she's an awesome person. So the other thing we did was really expand the advocacy tent. I can't say we did it. It's just that people got active. The biggest thing I think that happened is that when de Blasio took office in 2014, we had the arrival of Families for Safe Streets. I think this had the biggest impact of anything. These are all, I'm sure these are all people who have lost loved ones, children, siblings, parents to traffic crashes. And they became the most effective, most forceful advocates for safe streets really anywhere. They lobbied for a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. That could be its own entire talk. They want a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. It was down from 35. And it was a huge victory for this very new advocacy group, and just some of the best, most passionate advocates you'll ever meet. Amy Cohen, they should write a book about her. She was one of the founding members. I think the other thing that happened was we kept the pressure on de Blasio. He announced Vision Zero, but there was a summer of 2019. By June or July of summer 2019, we had 15 people die while cycling. The last of those people in June or very early July was a delivery cyclist named Robin Heitman, and a lot of Robin's friends in the messenger community joined us, and we joined them, and all these people came to a big die-in with I think around 1,100 or 1,200 people in Washington Square Park near NYU in Greenwich Village, and that's a sign that I made. That's me holding it up for the die-in, and we just hounded De Blasio and kind of kept the pressure on, and he announced then a green wave program to increase funding for cyclist safety. But to show you just how effective this is, the man at the bottom here is Brad Hoylman, who's a state senator and has been involved in New York City politics for a very long time. So, it used to be that I think politicians were afraid to come to this kind of in-your-face critical mass style stuff, but they really kind of are understanding where the political center of gravity is starting to exist. There was a big crackdown on delivery cyclists, the deliveristas, who rely on electric bicycles and work for a lot of the Seamless and Grubhub and those companies. They have been a huge political force. They've been unfairly targeted by the mayor for riding bicycles that up until very recently were illegal in New York State and New York City. That changed under a new law last year. But they've become a big political force. They just had a big rally last month to both call on the delivery service apps to pay them fair wages, but also to call on the city to give them the right working conditions, like access to bathrooms, just the general protection of safe streets as well. So we've just seen advocacy blow up in every possible direction, and it's been really gratifying to see. I think the other big step obviously has just been like what I think happens everywhere where there's a good bike share program, like Boston, like Somerville, like cities across the United States, is that we just mainstreamed cyclists into the transportation fabric of New York City. You just saw regular folks biking everywhere. It just became like commuters getting off the train at Grand Central, senior citizens. It's just been really remarkable to see regular New Yorkers, picking up their kids or going to work at a hospital. And obviously with essential workers this year, with the pandemic, there's just been even more focus on the need for getting bicycles and safe bicycle infrastructure into neighborhoods that haven't historically had access to them. I'm invited to go do stuff. I always wear a tie. We joked about this, I think, back when I was in Boston. But there's just been this mainstreaming of cyclists as like, we are a political voice in the city. The same way you'd have a housing activist on, or the way you'd have like a labor activist on a news program, you now have the Safe Streets advocates come on. And it is a weekly topic of discussion on most of the news programs and news sites in the city. So that's been a real change. These are just some of my favorite advocates, and you can see like we're all just like doing news hits all the time now, and we've been sought out, and we've become a really big force in the media. So it's been a really big change in the last 10 years. I think the big thing that has changed now, we've had the luxury of not having to talk solely about bike lanes. We are talking obviously about equity, who is left out of the discussion, what neighborhoods have been left out of the discussion. It's not tech bros biking from Williamsburg to Manhattan to go work at Facebook. It's everybody. And we've seen bike parking become a big part of the discussion. This is my buddy Shabazz Stewart. He runs a company called Uni, which is getting some contracts with cities to add bicycle parking, secure bicycle parking. He's become a huge part of the discussion. Bike parking itself has become this thing. I think you all have had experience probably with bike theft in one way or the other. There's a survey in New York City that said it is the second thing preventing more people from cycling in New York. The first is obviously safe streets, fear of getting hit by a car or passed too closely. And the second thing is fear of having your bike stolen. So we're starting to solve that problem. We're celebrating the small wins. These are my kids celebrating and their friends celebrating a bike corral installation in front of their school. The city is committed to adding 1,000 bicycle parking spaces this year and 10,000 over the next 3 years, I believe. So that's been a big victory for us. So like we're not just talking about bike lanes anymore. We're talking about what it means to have access to the curb and access to destinations. It's not just routes to business places. It's, can I get to school? Can I get to a caretaker's place, hospital, things like that. And then, the step 6, I wish I could say there was some magic to this, but this has just been a thing that's happened everywhere. It is beyond our control, but, the pandemic bike boom was real in New York, like it was in a lot of places. At the start of the pandemic, city bike trips just went through the roof, as people abandoned the subways. Now, I should be careful because, I'm sure you all know there actually isn't a whole lot of studies showing that it's unsafe to take transit. And we cycling advocates need to be good allies to transit, because if people abandon transit and start buying cars or start taking Uber or Lyft, that's bad for us. That's bad for everybody. But it has been a real booster shot for cycling, the pandemic. It's been really strange. I hate to say like silver lining, because it's been a terrible year for so many people, but it just kind of proves that the demand can be there given the conditions. The city responded to the bike boom here in New York by committing to putting up a bunch of temporary bike lanes. They did it in a really haphazard way. You can see there just wasn't a whole lot of thought. Drivers didn't really respect them. You can see the cones in the picture on the right didn't do much to tell drivers, and just spray painting bike and park didn't really do much for cyclist safety. There have been improvements since these pictures were taken, but it got off to a rocky start. The big success story, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, is outdoor dining. I know this is, I've seen pictures from the North End in Boston, how popular it's been there. The DOT, to their great credit, they very quickly marshaled an incredible plan to set up standards for outdoor dining spaces, taking into consideration emergency access, keeping hydrants clear. You can't quite see it, but like right around here, ramps, accessible ramps down from the curb. They were really thoughtful about this, and this has been a massive, massive success in New York City. We're now up to 11,000 open restaurants. Some of those are just on the curb. Some are a combination of outdoor seating on the sidewalk and on the curb. And then we also have this incredible open streets program, which has really expanded. Today, the mayor announced that they're going to be throwing more money at it, giving more public seating so that you don't have to buy something to go enjoy an open street. You don't have to pay $40 for brunch. You can just go, sit, read a book, enjoy. And, my favorite thing about what's happened with open dining is that it has really shown how inefficient cars are in cities. Like that seating where it says diner, join us. I think you can fit about 20 people in there. And on the left, obviously you have a car that's probably only being used by one person, maybe two at a time. And this is sort of from the other angle, you could park maybe 2 cars there, or you could seat 16 people. And these structures are actually getting very attractive. They were just plastic chairs and tables to start, and now they're building them out. And the mayor announced earlier this year that they would be permanent. So even when the pandemic is sort of considered over, they'll be able to keep doing it. And the restaurants have really put a lot of creativity into these spaces. They're just beautiful to walk by. They improve the pedestrian experience and the cycling experience. You're not going to be doored by an outdoor dining spot as you bike by something like this. It's really been quite lovely to see. And it's gone to every neighborhood. There's still some equity issues. We have some neighborhoods that are not getting the goods in the way that other places are. It helps if they have a bid. And there's some real equity issues with leaving this in the hands of business improvement districts. But you can just see how easy it has been to close off some of these streets to cars, open them to people, and create like an instantly attractive, like if you had put magnets and coated people in metal, you could not have attracted people to these spaces faster than just closing them to cars. It's been really great to see.
Hey, Doug, we actually have our first question. I'm sure
let's go for it.
there'll be a lot in the Q&A, but Stephanie asked, how do you talk to businesses that are so worried about parking they don't seem to respond to data?
Yeah. Well, so the pandemic was a weird thing, right? Because before the pandemic, we had exactly that problem. If you take parking in front of my business, how will my customers get here? They'll never get here. The pandemic uprooted that because nobody was going anywhere and you couldn't eat inside. And so once the city said, well, if it's safe to eat outdoors, we didn't have to have that conversation. Um, so it's a kind of a weird answer, I guess, because like we just did it and it proved that whole thesis wrong. Um, you can't really respond to data. I think now what you can do is show them pictures like this and show them pictures from the North End. Um, the local business improvement district just up the block from me, they close down the street every Saturday from 11 in the morning till 10 at night. On the Saturdays when they do it, the businesses see 3 times the amount of sales and revenue that they do on a normal day. So if you want data, that kind of stuff can help. Go to these businesses that have had these outdoor dining spots and see how it's helped them. Um, but I think as advocates, we tend to talk data a lot. Sometimes you just need to do stuff and point to the places that are doing it, and I think that's been the benefit of the kind of outdoor dining during the pandemic is it shows that it works, and people will do it. Yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think sometimes it's like we need to show, not tell, and we've had a lot of showing in the last year, which has been great. So yeah, I hope that answers that. Um, yeah, so and then the city expanded the open streets program so that it's not just businesses. I should add, um, and now you see spots like this. Um, this is a few blocks from where I live. Turn into this, and these are people who were on the day that I took this picture were celebrating a kid's birthday. Um, and I don't think these people would have considered themselves streets advocates before, but I don't think they're going to want to go back to this when they've experienced this. So I think sort of relates to what the question was a little bit of like, I think we just need to kind of give people the space and show where it's working. I think the experience with City Bike is a good lesson. When we started it, there was a lot of like, I don't want that in my neighborhood. I don't want that in my neighborhood. So it launched and it was a huge success. And within a year, 2 years, the same people who said, I don't want that in my neighborhood started to say, well, wait a minute, why aren't I getting that in my neighborhood? And I think you're going to see the same thing happen with open streets. There have actually been complaints now in my neighborhood from the businesses that are just beyond the reach of the open streets because when they happen, the foot traffic disappears from their streets and goes towards these spaces. And so the city is trying to work with them to figure out how to attract people to the places that don't have the open streets. Whether that's expanding the open streets or offering other incentives, we'll see. So I think the same pattern is going to play out. You'll see more people say like, why does Park Slope get the goods? We want my neighborhood to get it too. And the streets have opened up. These streets have just turned into places for kids to play. There's some programming and events happening. Streets for hula hooping in Queens. This is the Vanderbilt open street in Brooklyn, which has become immensely popular with kids drawing chalk on the ground. It's been great. And then one of the really cool things about it is how people have taken to this median, which is historically off limits when there's traffic. You would never want to sit here. And they're just bringing out their own tables and buying stuff at the bodegas across the street and just, grabbing a bagel, grabbing a beer, grabbing coffee, whatever, and sitting out. It's just been great. And it turns into it's the hottest nightclub in town now is the Vanderbilt Open Street. And I think this summer will probably be pretty wild. It'll be the summer of the open street. You're seeing seniors do it. You often hear people say, well, but these open streets are only for people who are fit enough to go for a run or go biking or be walking. What about seniors? These are literally older people playing bingo out in Queens on 34th Avenue. And to kind of loop it back around, we've now seen a growing political force arise out of the open streets movement to make them permanent. And this is Jimmy Van Brammer, who's was part of that political class that I was talking about. I think there's Carlina Rivera right there. So some of that Streets Pack first and second generation that's out there marching with people from the neighborhood for open streets, and it's been great to see. And now, just like in 2013, where this stuff was really, really popular, Transportation Alternatives did commissioned a poll from Siena College, and we're seeing immense support for this stuff across the city, including in neighborhoods that we're often told in the media don't want these things. They are wanted pretty much everywhere. It's a big city. There's always going to be people who disagree. I always say, like, we have two professional baseball teams, and half the city roots for one and half the city roots for the other. We're never going to agree on everything, but you do see immense support for these initiatives. I mean, 56%, a mayor who got 56% of the vote would win in a landslide. City Bike would be a great mayor. 75% of New York City voters, want more places for public seating, and the really salient part here is even if it would mean less parking, which again, like, taking parking used to be that political third rail, and now it's not. Who can argue with kids? 84% of people support more places for kids to play. Again, even if it means less parking. And again, in neighborhoods that have been historically underrepresented and where the city rolls out pedestrian plazas and safe streets, there's even higher demand. It's really been pretty great. And so now we have headlines like this in the New York Times. Instead of anxiety over the future of bike lanes, we have New Yorkers want this stuff to last forever. And I never thought I would see stuff like this in such a mainstream news outlet as the New York Times, but here we are. And so the bike war, as I see it, is over. We've won. It's kind of all over, but these little skirmishes now and then. And that's sort of the state of New York City as we go into an election that is essentially a month away. So thanks, everybody. That's the end of my talking at you part of the presentation.
Fantastic, Doug. A really great and inspiring talk. I think I believe New York City is ahead of Boston right now, and from what you're showing and talking about, it's inspiring. We have now a chance to open up the questions, and I'm gonna. There's one question that came in from Ara, and Ara, do you want to ask your question directly? We can unmute folks now who would like to ask questions. Great. So Chris, could you unmute Ara? I don't know if I'm able to.
You should be able to. Let me find her here.
See if I can do that.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Hi, Doug. Thank you. I grew up in New York City, probably longer ago than you went to Tufts. So this is wonderful to hear. I was asking about 14th Street in Manhattan and how that fared through the pandemic, and if you see that kind of private car ban model working alongside open streets or as an alternative to open streets, or how has the success of open streets impacted your thinking around that kind of change?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So 14th Street has been an immense success, but obviously the pandemic decimated transit ridership. So I don't really know how the 14th Street busway fared as we went into 2020. As we were ending 2019, bus ridership was way up, and bus speeds were way up. So that was great. I think a good example I could give is up here on Fifth Avenue in Park Slope, where I live. That's where they have the open street. That's where I had that picture of the kids sitting in the blue thing. That's a pretty major bus route. And so when they do the open streets, they have to reroute the bus to 4th Avenue, which is down the hill. And obviously it's great to have the open street, but I do think it brings up some real equity and accessibility issues for people. If you are used to taking the bus every Saturday afternoon to go shopping and you can't walk very far or at all, that's a real pain in the butt that they've done that. And you might not be so happy about the open street. So I think the future of some open streets will be that it will turn into, and this is utopian, a lot of stars would have to align for this to happen. Why isn't it a European style transit way where there's, the busway going down the middle and we've expanded the sidewalk up to as far as we can go. I think also the other thing I'll say is that much like I said, where you had neighborhoods before saying, oh, we don't want City Bike. oh, we don't want open streets. That's for the other neighborhoods. The great thing about the 14th Street busway is you have the Queensboro president, Donovan Richards, now basically saying, we deserve in Queens something as good as what they got in Manhattan. So there's a lot of talk about who deserves what, and the answer is everybody deserves everything. And so I think that's been the real beautiful, wonderful thing about 14th Street is that it sparked this conversation of like who deserves what. For those of you who have not seen 14th Street, it's nothing special. It's not like some European beautiful new pavement stones and tracks and all that. It's not that great, but it's just they just closed the cars, got private cars off, and it's just sparked a huge discussion. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. It has broadened the discussion about who these streets should be for, and how we can fold them into a more pleasant streetscape.
Great. I think we'll move on to Eva. You've got a question. I think you can unmute yourself. I can't seem to unmute you, Chris or Ted. Eva of Riverhead.
I am pushing the unmute button.
Great. Thanks.
Can you? Okay, good. Hello?
You're
Hi.
good.
So yeah, I just was wondering about, I think it was the cyber attack that affected the gasoline supply. And I was thinking, what do you think? Do you think this is maybe an opportunity to encourage bicycle riding and human powered ways of getting around?
I mean, we have a War on Cars Slack channel, which has been very active today because of all the news. And I'm sure you saw the pictures of like people putting gasoline in plastic bags, and the Consumer Protection Commission telling people not to do that. I think it's starting in the Southeast, right? And it's sort of moving its way. The gas shortage is going to sort of move its way up, right? So Atlanta, Raleigh, cities like that have been affected. And those are cities that are hugely car dependent. I would think that the bigger thing that might come out of this is not a move towards more bike infrastructure, people getting electric bikes or whatever, but a bigger move towards electric vehicles. So, I would love to be a Tesla dealer or somebody selling any new electric vehicle right now. Because I do think that when things calm down, people might do a reassessment of relying on gas-powered vehicles. We saw this with Texas, right? With the blackouts and the big problems they had with the storm. It did spark a big conversation about solar, some of it in bad faith, obviously. But so that would be my answer. I think the discussion is probably going to go more towards electric cars than bike infrastructure.
Thank you.
Great. We're gonna go in order in the chat, and then Gavin, we'll get to you as well. I see your hand raised. But next question is from Stephen Ringel, and everybody's unmuted. But let's wait till you're called upon so we can make sure this is orderly. But go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm unmuted. In Jamaica Plain, in meeting with our local business district group, they insisted that parking was essential for their business members and that everybody agreed with that. So we actually went out and did an informal survey, and we found that over 60% of businesses don't rely on parking for most of their customers, and employees actually have a difficult time getting to work because of the congestion within Jamaica Plain. But that was informal and anecdotal. Is there any repository of data that says, that gives us insights into the notion that parking is not essential for your local businesses? In fact, when you do change from a parking-driven access to more pedestrians, more public transit, more bikes, in fact, street traffic goes up and business visits go up. Is there any data out there that would help us make that case?
Transportation Alternatives did a study in New York in the East Village many years ago now, where they did intercept surveys of people arriving at a bunch of different businesses asking how they got there. And, not surprising for the East Village of Manhattan, most people arrived by foot. The second most people arrived by a combination of transit, subway, bus, and foot. After that was bicycling, and after that was driving. There are plenty of studies out there. I don't know if people saw, there was a thing, I'll send the link maybe later to Ken, about just looking at Yelp reviews, Yelp activity on open streets days, and how it went way up on those days. Now, granted, that's like a privileged, tech savvy, probably wealthier group of people who are leaving Yelp reviews and being active there. But on open streets days, apparently it went way up. I think New York City Department of Transportation, they did a lot of studies in the early days of building out the bike network, showing that sales at businesses on 8th Avenue and 9th Avenue, which were the first pair of protected bike lanes in Manhattan, went up by something like 20 to 30% after the bike lanes went in. You can't necessarily say that the bike lanes caused that to happen, but you certainly can say that it didn't hurt. So the research is out there. If you do a search for New York City DOT bike lane studies, businesses, you might find it. It's out there. But I would encourage, do those real intercept surveys. And, I know you said you did an informal one, but like if you can get enough that really it starts to become scientific, do it.
Great. Next question, we're just going in order of chat and then we'll get to the people with raised hands. We have Medford Biker, question about the police in New York City. Is Medford Biker still out there? You may not go by Medford Biker. Okay, if you aren't there, I'm going to just real quick, a comment from Jeremy Mendelson. Jeremy lives in Boston, moved to New York and came back. But Jeremy, you just said they just made 181st Street just like 14th Street?
Yes. Yeah, they added a busway, 181st Street, which was more congested than 14th Street. They also turned it into a similar style busway. There's local access if you're making a delivery or dropping someone off, but you have to turn off the next available turn. And it's already sped up buses. And it's the same thing. Everybody said it wouldn't work. Businesses complained. And, interestingly, there just hasn't been as much focus on the change. I think partially that's because it is in a part of Manhattan that is less obsessively covered by our media. It's Harlem as opposed to Greenwich Village. So again, there's a lot of equity stuff going on with that discussion. But I'd like to be charitable and think it's also just because it's the second one and it's just less controversial now.
That's great. Jeremy, if you have a follow-up question, think about it, but I'm going to move on to Gavin. Gavin, you got a question?
Yeah, two quick ones, if you don't mind. I was curious, what's the latest on congestion pricing in New York City? And did you go on that recent bike ride with the mayor?
Yeah, I don't know if I would get invited on a bike ride with the mayor, given what I say about him online. So congestion pricing, the last I heard was that it went in for the environmental review, which was just approved by the Biden administration, which is good. We talked about this on the podcast, right? Like I'm sure a lot of the urban planning folks out there know if they had called for an environmental impact study, it might have taken years for that to happen and possibly opened up the opportunity for lawsuits to stop it. But instead, it's just going to be an environmental review, which whenever it gets started might take just mere months. It's more of like a checklist that they sort of have to. So it should start, it's supposed to start or was by the end of this year, but the MTA I think is still not saying what their timeline is because the pandemic screwed up a lot of their internal timelines. But I expect it will happen. There's been some controversy from folks in New Jersey, from some of the legislators there. You might have seen some of them now threatening to retaliate by charging New York City drivers to come into New Jersey. And we're like, oh gosh, no, please don't do that. That would be terrible if you charge drivers to go anywhere. But I think it'll happen. And it'll be the same thing. We'll always wonder, like, why did we do this differently? So the mayor's bike ride, I didn't go. But then today he was talking about bike licenses. So it's apparently didn't teach him very much yesterday.
That's too bad.
Yes, yeah.
I had high hopes, but
I think, my take on him and this administration is that if he would just be quiet and let DOT do the work that it does, we'd probably be in better shape because they're doing a lot of really good stuff. And the projects that they have gotten on the ground, especially in the last just couple of months, since things started opening back up and they're in like prime painting season, have been really good. And he's sort of his own worst enemy because the more he talks, the less we're paying attention to the good stuff that is actually happening out there.
Right.
Cool, thank you.
Alex Frieden.
Thanks, Ken. Doug, we're super happy to have you here. I'm a Somerville resident and dad, and like you, I kind of would, love to bring my kids around more than I do. So you talk about this amazing transition in New York, going from Anthony Weiner, I want to rip these effing bike lanes out, to now pretty much the majority of the candidates for mayor trying to compete over number of miles of protected bike lanes. Can you talk a little bit? So in Somerville, we don't have quite nearly that level of focus on safe streets, on the candidates for either city council or for the mayor. And in Boston, I was just reading today, the number of the prominent mayoral candidates kind of saying on a 4-lane road in West Roxbury, we have no interest in making biking and oftentimes walking better there on Center Street. So can you talk about where you might have seen, you talk about the groups, but I'm interested in the candidate transition between remove bike lanes to maximize number of bike lanes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any one answer to that question. It's just been like, I think starting Streets Pack was a really helpful thing because part of what Streets Pack did wasn't just that we got out there and endorsed the candidates. We also got out there and volunteered and phone banked and petitioned and door knocked for these candidates back when such things were possible pre-pandemic. And so those helped foster relationships with those candidates. So a lot of us became informal policy advisors to these candidates. I mean, I because of my work with Streets Pack back in the day, and now a lot of the stuff that I do, get called from city council members and candidates to say like, hey, we're putting out this big news announcement about this new law we want to do. Like, could you help us? So I think fostering those early relationships was key. And I don't want to oversell it. We still have like a really stubborn set of city council members. We have our neighborhoods, like the entirety of Staten Island and Outer Borough, Queens, some parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn as well, that just are like, no way, no how. We don't want this stuff. Take your open streets. That's a Park Slope thing. Take your busways. That's a 14th Street thing. It's a tricky balancing act because I think you don't want to ignore the people in those neighborhoods. It's like a red state, blue state thing, right? Like you never want to say like, well, screw those people in the red states. They don't deserve health care, because that's not how it works. Everybody deserves good stuff. And there are lots of people who support good stuff in those districts. And it's the same here. So you don't want to say like, screw the city council district that doesn't want this stuff. Because it may be that city council member doesn't really speak for the majority of his constituents. So I think really the answer is just like, we've just really fostered those relationships and kind of told them like, hey, just keep us abreast of like what's happening. And if you have to make a decision that kind of sucks because it's the political win right now that's going to give you the bigger political win later, just let us know so we don't drag you on Twitter for it, and I feel like most of us have a really good relationship with these city council members where like, even when they kind of don't do the right thing, we're like, it's cool. We know what's really going on. Yeah, so there's no hard and fast answer. I think it's really just about like cultivating those relationships personally. They're all people, yeah.
I'd like to call on a couple of people if they're interested in asking questions, because I know you probably have a lot. Rebecca, it's like 2 a.m.
Yeah, Rebecca, I can't believe that you're on.
So just because you're awake at this hour, do you have any questions or observations since you moved from Somerville, well, Boston to the Netherlands? I think you're muted, Rebecca. That or it's a language thing. Yeah, we still can't hear you, dear.
Okay.
There
Yeah.
you are.
Okay. I've unmuted myself.
Good to see you.
Well, one of my observations was all the trash that I saw, and what we have here in Utrecht, and I think they have in Amsterdam also, are we have these underground containers that and they're in all the different neighborhoods now, and all the trash and the recycling goes into that, and it's linked with a computer so that when it gets filled, they just come out and they empty it. And so we don't have trash on our streets the way they have in New York City. So that, it's not perfect here,
No.
but
Well, you live in a first world country and we live in New York City, so it's very different. I will say that Catherine Garcia, who just got the New York Times endorsement for mayor, she's my first pick. She's a former sanitation commissioner. And talk about listening to advocates. There has been a huge, huge push from a small handful of advocates. There's a hashtag called Trash City, sometimes Trash City USA, that shows how ruined the pedestrian experience is by having trash piled up on the sidewalks. And you're talking about apartment buildings, that are 40 stories high or 20 stories high, and the recycling just takes up the whole block. She has talked about moving all the trash to a more European style container system, and flat out said in her New York Times interview, like, they asked her, well, where would you put all this? And she said, oh, it's easy. You just put it in the parking lane. You just take parking spots. It goes there. So I don't think it would be as fancy or computerized or underground as like what they have in cities in the Netherlands. And I remember actually I was in Leiden and being woken up by the sound of one of them being picked up and all the recycling, the glass being dumped into a truck. I don't think it would be as fancy as that, but you could see a system where they have containers on the, like, I think the bigger thing is we're talking about taking parking, which is like, I can't imagine that would have happened even 5 years ago. So yeah.
And I guess the other thing is that all of our streets in the city it's just one lane of traffic one way and one lane the other way. And I think you mentioned that earlier, that's where they get space for more bicycles and wider sidewalks. And though the sidewalks here aren't always necessarily wider, but
Right.
there is one street and one busy street, and they've that had protected bike lanes. They've taken out the protected bike lanes. They've made the sidewalks much wider. The sidewalks were very narrow before, and they are the bicycles are going back to sharing the road with cars. But I think because there are lots of bicycles, and they've made the road just one way instead of two way.
That's great. Yeah.
And we don't have we don't have protected bike lanes everywhere.
Yeah.
But there is one street there are some streets, for instance, that it's a bike lane on one side, a bike lane on the other side, not protected. And in the middle is a two-way street that's just one lane wide.
That's awesome.
You can imagine that.
Rebecca hit on something really good. And by the way, Rebecca, like my first international trip when I can finally travel again, I'm coming like to your house. I want to come to Utrecht, and we'll
it's happening this summer.
Oh, good.
So.
I think like we as advocates get really focused on protected bike lanes as the answer to everything, and they're not the answer to everything. And I think the thing that Open Streets has shown here in New York is that if you just remove the cars, like you don't need the protected bike lane. You're by default protected. And it's like removing the sharks from the beach. Like you don't need a big net. You just you got rid of the sharks. They're gone. It's fine. We can all swim now. And that was my experience in Utrecht of like, I was more interested in the streets that didn't have infrastructure, that were just overwhelmed by bikes and where cars were limited, slowed. I remember I took a tour with Mark Wagenberg, who does Bicycle Dutch, and he showed me like all the speed bumps. And he said how like a lot of the improvements in Dutch cities started with just slowing the cars down. And so sometimes our focus on infrastructure, that's always been my big lesson from the Netherlands, is like we drool over the infrastructure, but sometimes it's just like a nice calm street that's pleasant to be on.
Yeah, so it's culture. Stephanie had to leave, but she had a comment for you, which I thought you'd appreciate. She said the talk was great. I got to get the kids to bed. Tell Doug to get Donald Shoup on the show. There's a great.
Oh, I've
um,
reached out to him.
forum
Yeah,
post.
yeah. Because we tried to figure out how to. That's a great suggestion. We want to do a parking, well, not a parking episode, but many parking episodes because, sort of the joke I'm sure a lot of you have heard is that it's parking all the way down. Like, right, every fight you have about changing a street, whether it's businesses in JP or like a hardware store on Fifth Avenue where I live, is just like, where will people park? And so really getting into the nitty gritty of like why people are so protective of parking and talking with him. He's like a master of communications about this subject. And everybody should read The High Cost of Free Parking.
Yeah.
It's a tome, but it's really interesting.
Yeah. I'd like to hear from Vivian. I'm going to just, if you have a question, I'm
Yeah,
sure you probably
please.
do. Love to hear from you. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't.
No,
but-
that's okay. That's okay. No, I was actually thinking because last night I was at a very, very difficult meeting where it was neighbors that are just not happy about the fact that they're going to be getting bike share. And I remember years ago, I live in Mattapan, and then this is the last neighborhood in Hyde Park that's going to be getting bike lanes. And I was just, how is it possible? Everyone else has been so excited about getting it.
Yeah.
And I wonder, where have you all been? Like, what rock are you living under? And was very, very disappointed because the things they were saying, oh, now we're going to have bikes and the buses and we're going to have all these accidents. It was like, oh my gosh, we have so much work to do.
Yeah.
So my question is like, how do you just keep yourself going?
How do I keep myself going? I don't know. I really like riding my bike around the city,
No, I do too. But
Yeah.
I mean, you're far, go back to the days in the beginning where it was just a constant negative and how, I can only invite so many people to come out and ride with me. Right.
Yeah.
And those are the individuals that are never going to come out and ride with me.
Yeah.
And
I try to focus on the positive. I mean, it is very easy in the work that we do to let those negative voices overwhelm you. But I really try to remind myself that they do not represent the majority. And it is just a fundamental human truth. I remember I worked a summer job when I was at Tufts. I worked at the Gap in Harvard Square. And the only thing that I took away from that job is between my junior and senior year was the manager telling us at some employee meeting in the back saying, when a person has a negative experience, they tell 10 people. When a person has a positive experience, the average is less than 1. They sometimes don't tell anybody.
Right.
And so the people who have something to lose are always going to be louder than the people who don't know what they have to gain.
Yeah.
And I always say that it's sort of like, it's impossible to organize the residents of a building that hasn't been built yet. But the single family homeowners who don't want the multifamily home going up in their neighborhood, you better be sure that they're going to show up to the meeting and complain about the congestion and their views being destroyed and those people coming into the neighborhood. So I try to focus on the outcome and not the process. The process is important, but we're dealing with the same thing. City Bike just expanded to the neighborhood south of where I am, and you would think it was another country. Like you would think that they had never heard of City Bike, just like what you're explaining. And they're saying the exact same thing. So people are going to get killed. We don't need this out here. And it's like, well, you just don't know because nobody's used it yet. And so I just try to focus on the positive of like
one of the things that because this was a meeting that was held by the city employees, and I just always empathize with them because they have to put up with this and they're not necessarily able to say, so when I did make a comment about the fact that, this may not necessarily be for you because you probably own a car, but the folks that this may benefit are not here on this, kind of like, you don't let other folks know that this is happening. So we're going to continue trying to see if we can reach out to them because they're the folks that are most likely going to benefit.
My big thing is that when someone says nobody will, what they really mean is I won't.
I know.
Yeah. So I actually never speak for other people when I speak at a public meeting.
Right.
I say, I would like to bike my children to school. and I would like to be alive at the beginning and end of that trip. I don't actually care that you won't do it. Like, I'm sensitive to maybe the fact that some people can't do it because of mobility, disability, economic circumstances, whatever it may be. But I'm actually not going to be the bike advocate who gets at that meeting and says, everybody can do what I've chosen. I'm just going to say, I want to do it. And so I just, people hate change, and it's fine.
Yeah.
But
and then they were asking for data. Can you tell us how many people are how many people are using it? It's like, you don't have it in your neighborhood yet for us to be able to do that. But anyway, thank you.
Right. Yeah. It's good to see you.
You too.
Lena, are you still there? You had a question? Hand was raised.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, directly following up on what Vivian said, have you ever changed the mind or even incrementally moved the mind of the opposition, not politicians,
right,
but the people you're talking about, that show up to these meetings and really, break our hearts?
So it's like there's two answers to that question. One is like the direct answer, which is like yes, but that it's been so infrequent. So I think the best example was there was this woman who was vociferously against the addition of a pedestrian plaza in Fort Greene, which is a historically black neighborhood, very quickly gentrified over the last 20 years. And she was an older white woman and was using all sorts of fear mongering to say that like this pedestrian plaza was going to ruin the neighborhood, create, emergency access was going to be imperiled, vagrants were going to come hang out at it, all this kind of terrible stuff. And then I think shortly after it went in, some news reporter showed her like sitting in the pedestrian plaza. So, whether her mind was changed or whether she thinks it was good or she just resigned herself to the fact that it was there, I don't know. I think the second answer to that question is like, is it even worth it to try to think of the 2020 election? Was it worth it to try to direct like all of our organizing efforts towards convincing people who had voted for Trump to change their vote? Yes and no. You have to be respectful of people. There are our neighbors, our fellow Americans, but it's probably more worth it to activate all the people who didn't vote last time and who feel like, oh, gee, like I didn't realize what I have to gain or lose depending on the outcome of this election, this bike lane, this policy. So I tend to focus, I think that Open Streets has been great because we've now activated all these people. Those aren't advocates hanging out getting a burrito at the Mexican place around the corner from me. Those are just people who like want to go out to eat and now are like, this is really pleasant. And so, a smart advocacy group would be out there with a clipboard, like handing out membership forms. So yeah, I think like I think it's always useful to be respectful to your neighbors. I think the process we have for changing streets sucks. It's like people yelling at each other in a church basement or on a Zoom meeting, and that's terrible. So I try not to do that. But it's more fun to activate the person who like buys the e-bike and bikes their kid to school for the first time and is like posts a picture to Instagram of like, wee, this is fun. That's sort of like, to Vivian's question, that's sort of like what keeps me going.
Right. We have another follow-up question to Vivian's question. Jeremy, you wanted to talk about follow-up on outreach?
Yeah, sure. It's the method of outreach is so important, and all the work that I do in transit. I'm one of the co-founders of Transit Matters, and still heavily involved in that. And one of the things we run into so often is, and Doug, you touched on it just briefly, is that we have these. You ask everybody to come to a meeting at 6 p.m. in an empty auditorium, and it's you're asking a lot from people. You're only going to get the people who are really motivated, and most people just can't. And so it's like, if you want to go, if you want to go hear from bus riders, you go to where the bus riders are. You go ride the bus, you go to the subway station, whatever, and you talk to them in a way that doesn't ask very much of them. You ask good targeted questions, and you don't take much of their time. And like when they did the Go Boston 2030 outreach a couple of years ago. This is maybe going back a few more years ago. They found overwhelming support for a lot of the things we've been talking about here. But then we still have these meetings, and it's sort of like there's a little bit of a gap there with the between okay, yeah, people, the vast majority of people want this, but yet we're still going to West Roxbury and asking the people who don't like it, what they think. And it's like, well, we already decided this. But yeah, so some of that requires vision and leadership on the part of the politicians, and sometimes on the part of the city staff. To be honest, sometimes they're just a little too deferential to the people who are not, and they're not always willing to say that, okay, like, you're in the minority.
Yeah.
But I just think it's really important to talk about the method of outreach and trying to reach the people who, not necessarily in a biased way, but just trying to reach people who don't normally have a voice.
Yeah, I mean, I just did a talk yesterday with some folks in Houston, and we talked a lot about outreach. Like, they were doing things like going to restaurants to talk to the staff, the people washing dishes. How did you get to work? What would make your trip safer? That is not a person who can come to that meeting at 6 o'clock because they're probably working the dinner shift, right? So they would do the thoughtful outreach of really, like you said, meeting people where they are. Like you mentioned, bus rider intercept surveys, things like that. I think DOT does the community board meetings where people are screaming at each other and saying really outrageous things, they get a lot of headlines. But actually, I think DOT does in New York, does a lot of behind the scenes work of going to businesses, telling them what's going on, and then going to the community board meeting and saying, well, actually, we talked to the business owners and they're okay with this and they're aware of the change. I think my co-host, Aaron Naperstek, I don't know if this is his original idea, but he once said to me that the community process begins when I have heard about it. And that's sort of where you have to understand everybody is. So more outreach is good. The flip side of that is the idea that the project is the process, that if you just put the project on the ground, I think that the good thing with bike share, for example, is that the stations can be moved based on data. If no one's using it, that's what's sort of been my response to a lot of the people who hate it. I'm like, look, it's there. It's on the sidewalk. It's in the parking lane, whatever. In 3 months, if City Bike and DOT says that like only 100 people use that station in 3 months, you can tell them to move it, and they probably will. So I think just it's a lot of what we're talking about is paint to start. It's not capital projects. Just telling people this stuff can change. That's the beauty of a lot of what we do. It can change pretty quickly. But yeah, I think you're right. I think just meeting people where they are, and outreach is an ongoing process. Like it never ends.
I'd like to give a chance for my co-host, Ted Lester, to ask a question. Ted, I'm sure you've got a million questions, but is there one that comes to top of mind?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I did have one, and I didn't want to jump on anyone else, but I think actually it was Medford Bike asked it earlier. I'd be interested, Doug, in your maybe some positive experiences with the New York Police Department that have gone well. I saw I laughed at your slide with all the New York City police cars parked in bike lanes, which I know there's always a lot of negative stuff about them on Twitter and stuff. But are there any positive engagements you've had with the police department and as part of Vision Zero or some other aspect?
So I should qualify this because obviously, like, I think this is a privileged story that I'm about to tell because not everybody feels comfortable like engaging with the police, going into a precinct. It's not an option that's available for everybody, and there obviously is a huge move from Berkeley to here to get the police out of traffic enforcement for many good reasons. But a very positive story is the 78th precinct in New York City is the precinct that covers my neck of the woods. And every precinct has a monthly community council meeting where you can go. It's a very sort of like Americana Parks and Rec sort of thing. They will present an award to the cop of the month. They'll go over crime stats, theft and all the rest for the latest period. And a bunch of advocates in my neighborhood had been going to a bunch of these meetings for years. I had gone for a bunch of months, not as long as some others. and fostered a really good relationship with the community affairs guy. And he was basically just like, yeah, if you know any hotspots where people are parking in bike lanes or on the sidewalk or running red lights, here's my number, text me, we'll send someone out. You know, and we're always careful about that because you don't want to sick the police on someone and have something bad happen. But we just, like I was saying before about these relationships and how important they are, they had a section right by their precinct where their own officers would park their personal cars and just block this bike lane. It was just a painted bike lane. And one day after a street cleaner came through, one of my friends, who shall remain nameless, took some Jersey barriers and put them out so that people couldn't park in the bike lane. And they turned this into a Streets Vlog story, and he became the bike lane vigilante. And because we had built up such a great relationship with the community affairs guy, he called us laughing and said like, hey, like, okay, you guys had your fun. Like, you embarrassed us. We get it. What can we do to fix this? And we looked at the geometry of the street. We talked to the commanding officer in DOT, and it's literally a like 40-foot section of the street. DOT provided the materials. They put down like these plastic, you know, like the raised plastic curb with the thick delineators. And they left enough room for these 2 or 3 cops to park their cars on the other side of it. And we got this like one section, like less than half a block section of bike lane. Then we went so far as to surprise the commanding officer of the precinct at the time, Mike Amiri, was a great guy, and named the bike lane after him later.
Oh, that's great.
There's some other details of the story that like are not quite as positive, but overall, you know, it's about fostering those relationships. And again, to just bookend it, like that's not an option for people who don't look like you and me, perhaps, but and it's one precinct, you know, out of a police force with a $4 billion budget. So, you know, it's like rolling that boulder up the hill. But it worked, and we got, you know, they were happy to get the good press out of it too. So it was, I look back on that story and always have a nice smile when I think about it.
That's good. Yeah, baby steps.
Yeah, culture is really hard to change, especially in the police, you know, and I'm sure it's similar in places like Boston. We have just so many police officers who don't live in the neighborhoods that they serve, so they drive. So, yeah.
Great. We're getting a little bit late, and I think we're running out of questions that people have. I'm sure there's many questions that people want to ask. I think I'm going to close it out with maybe a question and a comment. I think we are, you know, in Boston, I think the biggest struggle right now is, I call it the battle of cart width. There's only so much cart width on a street. And we're obviously in constant discussions with elected officials and our version of the DOT about parking removal. We've had some victories on some easy streets, and you know, we've got some challenges up ahead. There's one street that you probably know, Doug, Highland Street in Somerville, which goes from Davis Square all the way up to Somerville City Hall, and we are actually, the mayor has said that we're going to remove all parking and put in protected bike lanes for the length of the street, which we're thrilled about. I think the implementation is going to be challenging. We may actually engage you as a consultant to help us through this process, because I think a lot of it's going to be business outreach and trying to change people's minds. But I think that is the biggest challenge that I see that we face in Somerville and Boston and Cambridge, is basically the battle for cart width and trying to, you know, and I love your focus on open streets. We have had shared streets. We have neighborways, which are like bicycle boulevards, which are gaining traction. But I do think that the democratization of the street is fantastic, and making this beyond bike lanes, as you pointed out, that it's everybody, it's all ages, it's all modes are going to help us. So I think your talk has given us some guidance and some tools, and I'm sure you could talk about this for hours. But I just wanted to close by saying thank you for you know, the tools that you've given us. Thank you for the many more tools that exist on the war on cars, because I've learned a lot. And you know, we've applied some things that we've learned on the war on cars. So I would thank you for your continued advocacy. We would love to have you, and I'm thinking you want to come up to Boston and we can maybe show you some of our successes, but also show you some of our challenges and maybe get some free advice for the price of a bike ride and some beer. Really want to thank you for what you've done and the inspiration that New York City's become, because New York City was not a place you wanted to bike in 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly it's changed.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, everybody, I have such a soft spot in my heart for the Boston area, for Somerville in particular. I love it up there. I think earlier, real quick, like I look at some of the bike infrastructure that's going into Boston now, like near the Public Garden, right? Like I wish we had something that looked as good as that in New York. So, I think the best part of all of this is that we learn from everybody, and no city has like all the answers. So these are all like very high level, great questions. So I really appreciate everybody's interaction here. And thank you for having me.
Oh, we really appreciate it. And this is recorded. I should have told you beforehand, if you're okay with that.
I don't think I said anything that's going to get me in trouble, but we'll see.
Nothing worse than you've already said on
yeah, exactly.
So we'll make this available, and we'll share it with you, of course. And this is really fantastic. And we'd love to see you up here, and we'll come say hi when we're down in New York.
Yeah, next time at Redbones, right?
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I have to also say thank you to Aeronaut, who is our sponsor for this series. So thanks to the folks there. Doug, thank you. And thank you for everybody for hanging on. And cheers to you, Doug, and enjoy the warm months and maybe a less of a pandemic life.
Exactly. Yeah. Stay safe, get vaccinated, be safe, be healthy.
Very good. Thanks, Doug.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Doug. Nice. Thank you.